As we're speaking about the past, if you could time travel to any historical event or era, which would you choose and what would you hope to witness or change?
I think, reflecting on the last Parliament and some of the really significant things that happened in it, I think if there are two things that have happened that have, caused a huge amount of misery and anguish. The first would be the war, the war in Ukraine, and
Mm,
the second would be the Israel-Gaza conflict.
mm,
So it would be either 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, and to try and influence, the pattern of kind of Russian progression from that moment on. I don't know, bring the Cold War to an end in a more constructive way that meant that Russia felt like a proper partner in, Western
yeah.
values, and not things not developed the way that they did, or perhaps go all the way back to, and it's really hard, I guess, to pinpoint the start of the Israel-Gaza conflict, but 1948 is probably as good a
Right.
place as any. And I don't know what the change is, to be honest. Um, Not that you would change, not to change the formation of Israel.
The thing is, that's quite a difficult one because whatever you say you would do is somewhat going to be picking either Israel or Palestine. You know, it'd be difficult to say you'd go back and do something neutral.
What the world would like to see now is a two-state solution. And
Yes.
maybe if those two states could have been formed in 1948, maybe that's the pivot that could have saved so much bloodshed in the decades that have followed. So if I just think about the things that are obviously they're creating a huge amount of destruction and misery abroad, but the way that that plays out in the UK, in my
Mm,
constituency, across the country, and obviously around the world as well, I think those are the two things that you would want to go back and sort of, from a standpoint of this is what happened next, this is what happened later, those are probably the two things you would want to alter
yeah.
somehow.
How do you think your previous professional experiences, such as your work in finance, have influenced your approach to politics and policy making?
I think that's a really interesting question. One of the things that I find is that very few accountants in the House of Commons, opposed to lawyers, there are a
Yeah.
lot of lawyers, or people who've worked in public policy somehow, or people who've been local councillors. There's an interestingly large number of new MPs who've served in the army,
Right.
which I find very fascinating. And obviously, back in the sort of the 60s and the 70s, there were a lot of MPs who'd served in the army because
Mm.
obviously so many people had during the Second
World
World
War
War.
Two.
So it's kind of like, but that sort of fell away over the sort of subsequent decades. But now it's really interesting to see how many there are. That's by the by, because obviously that's not my own story. There are not many people who have worked in sort of accountancy, and I don't know, and I think it's partly because the skill set is really different. If
Yeah.
you're an MP, you need to be quite gregarious for a start, and I don't think all accountants necessarily are. And you need to get your head around a wide range of topics, whereas
Mm.
accounting can be quite specialist. And you need much more, and I think probably the biggest skill is to be able to sort of really to talk about your constituents' experiences and to be advocating for change. And again, that's not really an accountant skill set. Certainly, I find a lot of the issues and the topics around the economy, the Treasury brief, and so on, much easier to understand
Oh,
because
yeah, obviously, because
I
of your
can talk
background.
about.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I can talk about VAT policy till the cows come home, and I have a real nerdy interest in VAT, and that's what I used to do in my old job. So from that perspective, it's quite useful to have that sort of detailed knowledge. But I mean, what I would always say, and certainly to any one of your listeners who's thinking about a career in politics, the whole point I always feel about the House of Commons is that you don't have specific training, you don't
Mm.
come from a particular background, and the strength of the Commons ought to come from the fact that we come from a wide variety of backgrounds. So although I find there are some things of interest and use in my past life that I bring to the Commons with me, there are also so many things, new things that I'm learning every single day, new skills I've had to develop, new knowledge, so much new knowledge that I've developed. And the same is true for every single other person. And I think any of the new intake who are coming in thinking that they're somehow better equipped to be an MP than anybody else has really misunderstood what they're there to do.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes there's a frustration out there in the general public that MPs themselves are more skilled or more competent or more, ministers in particular. What I would say is, firstly, that's often based on a slightly cynical view of MPs.
Yeah.
Most of us are genuinely quite smart people, genuinely really care, are really interested, and are, very savvy and very able to understand what the problems are and think about the solutions. But also, that's not the point. Sometimes people get frustrated with me, and I'll be kind of like, I'm not a lawyer. I can't advise you on this legal process that you need to go through in order to do this thing. And they might get frustrated about that. But, it's not an expectation that I've had a legal training or anything like that. And the whole point is that we are, or should be, a diverse range of backgrounds. Obviously, some of the more straightforward, markers of diversity. We should be from different ethnic backgrounds. We should be of different religions. We should certainly be, an equal division of the sexes, and we're nearly there now. 40%
40%.
female.
Yeah.
We're going
I'm just sort of waiting for it to get to 50.
I know. Much greater age range than used to be. Real, really youthful bunch, actually. One of our Liberal Democrat, funnily enough, our new Liberal Democrat MP for Maidenhead, Josh Reynolds, he's 25.
Wow.
And the MP for Maidenhead before him was Theresa May. So all of his life, growing up in Maidenhead, Theresa May was his MP, and he became the next MP after her, which is pretty extraordinary. So I think there's a few things, but it's not. I wouldn't say being an accountant is not a typical background, I think, for an MP. But I think every background is useful, and nothing is more valid than anything else.
What advice would you give to a young person from a non-political background who is considering a career in politics?
I think that's an excellent question, and I've been thinking about this a bit. So, I think you say a non-political background. I think everyone is political in one way or another, and it doesn't always kind of present as party politics. But, a lot of young people, perhaps they haven't really thought about a party affiliation, but they will feel passionately about one topic or another. And I know from my inbox, from hearing from my younger constituents, the Israel-Gaza situation is something that's, people feel very strongly about. Climate change, people feel very strongly about. Social justice, people feel very strongly about. Animal welfare, people feel very strongly about. So I think there are lots of different issues, and people don't necessarily think about it as being interested in politics, but they do nevertheless care a great deal about an issue or a range of issues. And young people, quite rightly, just often want this country just to be a better place to live in, a better place to grow up in, and something that will give them a better future. And so I think if that's you, and you don't necessarily see party politics as the way to kind of achieve that, I think that there's a number of things you can do. I think firstly, there are a range of pressure groups. We've talked about so animal welfare, just to be an obvious one, but there's obviously a lot of animal welfare charities out there like RSPCA or WWF or whatever, and they are always looking for, obviously they want fundraisers, and they want membership, people who manage their membership support. They also need is people who can write policy, run campaigns, and pressure the government, put pressure on the government to change their policy and legislation in a way that they think will benefit the cause that they care about. So joining a pressure group of something that you feel really strongly about is something I think that just be a supporter, you can get involved in their campaigns. But if you're looking to make it a career, then looking for a job in that sort of work, something you do care about. And another way, it's kind of related, but there are around and about Westminster organisations called think tanks, and these are often funded to do research. And certainly politicians and policymakers within political parties obviously often rely heavily on research and analysis that's done by think tanks. One of the ones that I refer to a lot is called the Resolution Foundation. Some more who are kind of a bit more, if you like, on the right wing of politics, the Adam Smith Institute. And they are generating policy ideas a lot. So if you are somebody who's really, really interested in ideas for how we could change legislation or change policy in order to make a difference, then those are the kinds of organisations you could go and work for. And if you're completely apolitical, but you want nevertheless to go and make a difference and really make a difference to people's lives, there are many, 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 many jobs in the civil service, in local government. And, you know, a lot of that is kind of like line delivering services, but there are also developing policy for how those services should be delivered, and, you know, developing strategies, thinking about how budgets should be allocated and so on and so forth. And dare I say, your opportunities are greater in local government, but you can always be elected as an independent representative.
Yeah.
And that, as I say, is quite common in local government. We don't have it. I'm just trying to think. Across the Richmond Park constituency, I don't think we have it, but elsewhere, in other, you know, not far away, we have people who have been elected just to be an independent voice for their local residents. So, you know, it is possible to achieve elected political office without joining a political party. But if I may say, political parties are the best way in this country, in my view, of achieving change. You get people who come together around a set of ideas, they agree that they're going to fund the campaigns to get certain candidates, and when those candidates are elected, they can work together in Parliament and push for change. And at the end of the day, politics is all about having the numbers. More of you than there are of them, then you win, and that's how you achieve
That is
change.
how it is, yeah.
So I think there's a tendency to be a bit skeptical of party politics, or to see it as something kind of bad, or you know, the idea that we're all just kind of like coming together and voting the same way is sort of like we're just sheep, we're not independent thinkers, or that, you know, there's something kind of compromising about it. I think that's quite a limiting way to look at party politics. Actually, it's a very sort of sensible way of organising a disparate group of people, you know, to affect the kind of major change that most people want to see if they get involved in politics. And it can't be done by just 650 people all acting independently of each other. You would be able, each of them be able to, you know, maybe make a small number of changes, but big change happens from people acting together, and that's what party politics is about.
If you could enact one quirky law that reflects your personality or values, what would it be and why?
I have any number of things that just make me quite cross on a daily basis. Now you're asking me if I could legislate against any of those. It would probably be, I don't know though. Too much of a liberal. There are things that annoy me. I'm like, I wish people wouldn't do that. But that doesn't mean to say I would take away their right to do it if they wanted to. It's more that kind of like, why can't people just be grown up and be sensible, take responsibility? And it's much less about, you know, enacting legislation to stop people doing stuff. I mean, the things that I find that really wind me up are people being inconsiderate, like littering. Why would you do that? Speeding, I just think, is really careless and unnecessary. So it's that. Those are the things that I find, you know. But again, it is that kind of like, I don't necessarily want to take away people's freedom to do stuff. More than I wish they would be more conscious of their freedom and conscious of other people's rights, and that we could, you know, conduct ourselves with a bit more thought and care. So that there you go. I think that reflects my values. It's like, I don't think we need more. I don't want to pass laws. I just want everyone to behave better. How about that?
That's a good answer. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sarah. It was amazing to speak with you today.
Absolute pleasure.
Listeners, join me next week on Women in Westminster when I'll be speaking to Wendy Chamberlain.